Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the sponsor would yield.
Mr. Dinowitz, will you yield?
Yes.
Mr. Dinowitz yields.
Thank you, sir. Lewis Morris, Francis Lewis, Philip Livingston, and William Floyd. It's your happy trivia day. Do you know who they are, sir?
I do.
All right, excellent. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
Bill, sir.
This piece of legislation that we're taking up today, just after Christmas, was introduced on Christmas Eve. And I'm sorry for Mr. Cratchit and the Legislative Bill Drafting Commission, who I hope was able to get an extra lump of coal on the fire that day so that he could number this thing before the Christmas holiday. But as you know, this legislation would probably make him divest that lump of coal nonetheless. Cancel rent, that's what we're talking about today. They can put a lot of different flowery tones on this thing. They can say that this isn't cancel rent, but the more times that I hear a legislator tell me this bill does not cancel rent, the more convinced I am that this bill is all about canceling rent. Who do we think pays the property taxes on those buildings? The renters do. They pay the rent. The landlord pays the property taxes. Those property taxes go to our municipalities and our schools. When they pay the water bill, they're paying for the water in the sewer system. It's an excellent relationship. It's probably one of the reasons our founding fathers looked and said, you know, contracts between individuals and landlords are probably a decent thing. So where do we stand today in New York State after this pandemic? You know, we talked about this in the context of the pandemic. We're leading in the unemployment rate. We're in the top 3 in the United States. So if you take that petri dish of all of the United States, look how the policies are doing. We're rated pretty poorly, bottom 3 or top 3 for unemployment. We're leading the nation in exodus. There was actually a number of articles this summer you probably saw. Sorry for your New York State or for your New York City legislators, but you've watched your districts. You represent less people today than at the beginning of the pandemic. I may represent similar amount. New York City legislators who actually represent fewer people than I do today. And listen to this statistic of 3.57 million people. 3.57 million out of 8 million left New York City. You're like, wow, that's not right. That's right, because 3.5 million people moved into New York City this year. What did their incomes look like? Well, it's an overall loss of $34 billion in income. The average person that left New York City, their income was $140,000 a year. Who came in? Someone with an average income of $82,000 a year. Okay, cancel their rent. What's New York State doing about it? Well, we have a $175 billion budget. Today we're canceling rent. We have $175 billion in state debt. What do we say? Kick the can down the road. We have a $14 billion, at least, I don't know, that number changes every day, and it seems to keep going up, deficit. Cancel the rent. I mean, it makes sense, right? This legislature, our governor have said, New York State, we don't pay our bills, or we'll just push it on the next generation. Why should we expect somebody in New York City or anybody renting in New York State to pay their bills? That's fair. I mean, I hate hypocrites too. The Iroquois had a really great policy-making mind in this. They had a 7-generation rule. And what the rule of 7 generations said, that any decision that they make today, they considered what that impact was going to be 7 generations from now. Not the next election cycle, not the budget. They thought 7 generations in advance. We can't think 2 steps in advance in this legislature. What's the first and second order of effects? Well, we can tell you, we've already said people are moving out of New York City. The wealthiest people are moving out of New York City. So as the wealth moves out of our state, landlords, the value will drop. We can see that, right? They're not investing in those properties because they don't have rent coming in. So the value in that property drops. They'll go to your local governments and they'll say, look, not only do I not get as much income from this, but I haven't been able to invest in it. You got to give me a break on my taxes. And you know what? We'd be wrong not to do it in this legislature. So the third order of effect, now we've got less revenue coming in when we have a huge deficit problem because we haven't allowed landlords the opportunity to get the revenue to invest in those properties so that we can tax them. And when you get to the second and third order of effects, now you're talking about what are we losing in investment? Because we've got a budget coming up, right? And now we're just talking about the 50-meter target. That $175 billion, we're just going to do that again? We're going to turn it into 180, 190 this year? So then, when you're cutting your schools or you're cutting your infrastructure investment, you know that you're kicking that can down the road. Now, we're not investing in our youth or our infrastructure. Which is it? Maybe both. Then our youth, who isn't as intelligent to handle the problem that we've given them, also has a bigger debt, a bigger deficit, and an infrastructure that's crumbling even more than it is today. I mean, it sounds like a good plan. Cancel rent. It's popular. No renter in my district really wants to pay rent. So I talked to landlords on the way here, and I want to just highlight a couple that are from the same town. I talked to a number of them, all different walks of life, all different facilities, to owner-occupied, to, you know, hundreds of units. One in particular, it was funny because I called him up and I could just hear that he had a smile on his face. And I said, well, sir, where are you right now? Because it sounds like you're somewhere sunny. And he said, oh, I'm in Aruba. And I said, wow, congratulations. When are you coming back? He said, you mean back to Georgia? And this was a guy who used to be my neighbor in Watertown, New York. He moved to Georgia this year. Well, why'd you move to Georgia? Well, I'll be honest with you, we are moving our headquarters to Georgia as well. New York is a very difficult place to do business. Well, isn't that a New York story? Haven't we heard that one before? This is a guy who leveraged state money to purchase and got tax credits for a lot of those places that he's now having a hard time collecting rent on, believe it or not. I empathize with him only because his New York business is doing so poorly. But at least he made enough money here to be successful down in Georgia. Well, congratulations. That's what our policy did for him. And the other guy, I think this is a perfect example. This is a guy who works a regular job, who said, look, I don't have a 401k, I don't have a pension, but what I've done is I've invested, and I'm very proud that I've invested in these properties in Watertown, New York. He's got 16 different units, right? A few different buildings. He works very hard, does a lot of the work, picked up a lot of skills along the way so that he can manage those properties, and does so with a lot of pride. Don't you know, one of those, he just picked out one tenant and he said, here's somebody who their job status did not change this entire pandemic, but as soon as the governor put that order in, that tenant stopped paying me rent. Now my regular job is paying the mortgages for those buildings. The contract is up, and I said, well, I can understand your frustration. And that's what I'm carrying here today. And still, we're only looking at the 50-meter target. Yeah, let's talk about those guys. Lewis Morris. So, in case you missed it, Lewis Morris, Francis Lewis, Philip Livingston, and William Floyd, they were the New York signers of the Declaration of Independence. What did they have in common? They own land here in New York State. Lewis Morris, well, guess what? He wasn't even really, he was sort of loyal to the crown until the British took away the value in his land. They destroyed some of his property. And guess what? He changed his mind enough to sign the Declaration of Independence as a representative from New York State. Francis Lewis, he was a New York City merchant. Philip Livingston, guess what? Landlord in Brooklyn. William Floyd, he owned 4,400 acres in Brookhaven. Those are the guys that put the crown right on the flag. There's Lady Liberty. That Declaration of Independence that they signed, it shut down. They had complaints with the king, and I encourage all of you to read this again. And as we're about to swear an oath, don't violate the Constitution in voting for this bill. The Declaration of Independence, they were frustrated with shutting down courts, which has consistently been done. Imposing taxes without their consent, abolishing valuable laws through executive order from the king, obstructing administration of justice. That's sounding familiar in this debate. And they put right in the Constitution that you can't just take someone's property without due process. It makes sense. They were pretty ticked off that the king did that with theirs. That there's a right to life, liberty, and property. And there's a right to enter into contracts, one free New Yorker with another. I'm disappointed that this body voted down the germaneness of my colleague's excellent piece of legislation. Because we swore an oath 2 years ago, we're about to do it again if we were lucky enough to get reelected, to do our jobs. There is nothing more germane than checks and balances and the legislature reasserting itself as a co-equal branch of government. And proof is that we're convening today to vote on something that really doesn't have any direct impact on a pandemic. This doesn't amend the public health law. So clearly we can convene. Why wouldn't we reassert ourselves as a co-equal branch of government? And when you balance all of these things, suicide is a pandemic, overdoses are an epidemic, poverty has a mortality rate. All of these things need to be taken together. And as my colleague pointed out, one man may try very hard, may be very intelligent, may surround him or herself with the best staff available, but it's not going to govern New York State. We didn't set it up as a republic because one person can do this job. It requires checks and balances. It requires a representative democracy. To those with their blacked out screens right now that have turned their video off and their mic off and are maybe enjoying a cup of coffee or reading a book, stop phoning it in. Somebody very wise once told me that the world is run by people who show up. And frankly, I'm embarrassed to be a part of this legislature today. I hope that in 2021, we can turn it around and reassert ourselves. There is nothing more germane than checks and balances. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the rest of my time.